Hi, welcome to Chapter 5. In this chapter, we're talking about imperial reforms and colonial protest. In Chapter 4, we talked about how very strong the bond was between the British and the colonists. So now we're going to look at the things that start drawing them apart, things that start breaking that bond. So at the end of this chapter, you'll be able to identify several acts that made the colonists begin to think about protest, and you'll be able to identify key players in these events. One of the first laws that came down from England that really started to draw a wedge between the colonist and the mother country was the Stamp Act. Now, when we talk about the Stamp Act, we're not talking about postage stamps as such, not the kind that you go to the post office and buy and stick on a letter to mail. We're talking more about like a watermark kind of thing. And basically, anything printed on paper required some sort of stamp. It could be a watermark, like I said. It could be sort of like a notary punch, that little embossing kind of thing. So the reason that the Stamp Act came about was obviously to raise money. The average English taxpayer paid 26 shillings per year in taxes. So the colonists were only paying anywhere from half to 1.5 shillings per year in taxes. So it wasn't that the colonists were being taxed so much more. They felt like they didn't have representation in the decision to charge the Stamp Act tax. The Sugar Act of 1764 just wasn't enough to raise money. So the Stamp Act of 1765 required that anything printed on paper have this revenue stamp. And there were penalties for not having the stamp on your paper goods. Most of the time it was a trial without jury, and the judge would fine you. So no such thing at this point as a jury of your peers for violating the Stamp Act. This really made the colonists mad, and they began these violent protests against the Stamp Act because it seemed to control who could afford free speech. Remember, at this time, when we say newspaper, we're not talking about the kind of newspaper you see today. We're talking about something more like what you might think of as a newsletter, a pamphlet sometimes even, where people would print their opinions and they would send them out to people. So if you couldn't afford the watermark for that, then you couldn't afford to have free speech, which is what really starts making the colonists mad. But Parliament declined to give them a hearing about their concerns, and they passed the Stamp Act anyway. Again, this was more about taxation without representation than the cost, because the colonists were actually paying a very low amount of taxes. So the Stamp Act Congress asked for British repeal, which leads to the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. But other than just taxation without representation, there were some other problems that the Stamp Act caused. It really kind of brought awareness to the colonists. So they still considered themselves British, but they felt like they'd been denied their basic British rights because they didn't have representation for this tax decision. The colonists actually had no direct representation in Parliament. It showed that the British government, saw the colonists as dependent and not equal, which really starts to make the colonists mad. After all, they're the ones who've taken a lot of chances. They left the country they came from. They pioneered a new country. So this is not going over well at all with the colonists. They feel like they've been slighted and disrespected. This draws the colonists together. This is how the colonists then begin to bond against Great Britain. Remember, Chapter 4 was all about how they bonded together with Great Britain. Chapter 5 is where we start learning about what starts breaking that bond. The Sons of Liberty was a group that developed, and they led resistance against many of these acts. The Stamp Act was one of those. They were pretty violent, too. We'll talk a little more about the Sons and Daughters of Liberty as the semester goes on, but in this particular case, they actually targeted Andrew Oliver, who was the Massachusetts distributor of stamps. And now they didn't stone and hang him, but they did stone and hang an effigy, which is basically like a voodoo doll. So it was meant to represent him. They stoned it, hung it, beheaded it, and burned it. I mean, stoning and hanging is not bad enough, so they're going to behead it and burn it too. They totally wrecked his house. And then their next victim was Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson, who was barricaded into his house. They looted it, they burned it, and this violence led all appointed stamp collectors to quit. So they didn't get the Stamp Act appealed in, or repealed, I'm sorry, in Parliament, but they did at least get the stamp collectors to quit. So the Sons of Liberty were very violent, as we just heard. The Daughters of Liberty struck another way. They hit the mother country where it hurt by hitting their pocketbooks, by boycotting British goods. So these women get together, they make their own tea, they make their own cloth, and they turn it into social events. They have spinning bees to make fabric, and they even have contests for that sort of thing. It actually gives women a role in political dissent. It also gave them a voice. Now, they couldn't vote, but they could have a voice and they could have input in the politics of it all. There were actually Sons and Daughters of Liberty chapters in every colony at this point. So the daughters are the ones who declared the boycotts, the sons enforced them. So the Daughters of Liberty are saying, you know, we're not going to buy British goods, we're going to make them ourselves. And they worked really hard to do that. And if any of the Sons of Liberty caught someone buying British goods, they inflicted fear in those people so that they would stop. So officially, they condemned violence, but they didn't have protesters arrested. So that's how the Daughters of Liberty did not condemn or officially condemned violence, but the Sons of Liberty were there to back them up in very violent ways. So I love talking about the Quartering Act of 1765 because there are some misconceptions about it, but also because John Mulaney made jokes about it on Saturday Night Live recently. So I will be sharing a link to that for you to watch, and I'll tell you how to get to that part so you don't have to listen to the whole thing. But anyway, the Quartering Act of 1765 was enacted by England just because it was so costly to house English troops in the colonies. Now, you know, we've talked in the past about the French and Indian Wars, just for one war, you know, not to mention the wars that the colonists got involved in with the Native Americans. But just the French and Indian War, for example, Great Britain sent troops into the United States, or what becomes the United States, into the colonies to help protect this land. And it was expensive to do. And so all it required, all the Quartering Act of 1765 required, was for colony governments to provide British soldiers with room and board and food. That's it. Just please feed our people and give them a place to rest. So they're not saying invite them into your home. You give up the master bedroom suite so that these soldiers can have it. Nothing like that. It was just feed these soldiers and give them a place to rest because they are there to protect you. It's part of the reason that that bond was so strong between the colonist and the mother country. Some colonies went as far as to build barracks for them. They built large areas to house soldiers. Some local inns housed them. Some slept in stables. Some stayed in taverns, and some stayed in wineries. Some of them stayed in empty houses. And when I say outhouses, I'm not talking about like what we think of as a country outhouse, but an outhouse like a shed, you know, a storage building. They slept in barns, anywhere that there was some free space. It was never the intent to boot the colonists out of their home. That was not the practice, nor was it the intent. Again, the colonists had no representation in this decision, and because of that, New York refused to sign it. So Parliament made the New York Restraining Act, which said New York could not sign any additional law until they complied with the Quartering Act. So there are some problems with the Quartering Act of 1765. First of all, the colonists are angry because they did not have a voice in the decision. There was no representation in Parliament to represent the voice and the wishes of the colonists. The other problem is that the soldiers are staying in public places. Remember, they stayed wherever they could. Sometimes that meant sleeping in a winery or in a tavern or in a church building. So we have all of these soldiers who are very publicly seen. And because they're publicly seen and because the colonists are mad about having to house and feed them, there becomes a conflict between these people. So fights break out between the soldiers and the colonists. And that leads to the Boston Massacre of 1770, when 5 rock-throwing colonists were killed by British soldiers. And at that moment, then, we start to see the colonists develop a lack of trust for the redcoats, the British Army. So, back in Britain, while the colonists and the soldiers are fighting in the colonies, Grenville, whose whole idea of this Stamp Act was to begin with, was proving to be really unpopular, even back in England. And it was starting to have an impact on King George III's public acceptance rate. So he fired Grenville. The British merchants wanted all of these acts repealed because it was having an impact. Remember, the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, the Daughters of Liberty were boycotting British goods, and the Sons of Liberty were enforcing those boycotts. It was really hurting the British merchants. So the British support for the colonists was really kind of split. Some supported the colonists, and some thought that they were really making things bad for the mother country. So a new prime minister, Rockingham, got Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. The thing is, with Rockingham, he also said that Parliament's power was supreme and supersedes colony law. So we have a repeal to the Stamp Act, which should make the colonists happy, but now this same man says, by the way, Parliament's law is more important than your law, and you'll live by our laws because you're our colonist, which totally makes them seem dependent as colonists, and they do not like that. So with all that conflict, Rockingham was actually only prime minister for a year, and the aristocrats in Great Britain really were afraid their taxes were going to start rising through the roof, and they didn't want that. They didn't want their taxes to raise just because the colonists were boycotting their products. So the economy could be getting bad, which would really make things bad for King George III. Remember, he's got to keep his public perception up. So William Pitt then is appointed the new prime minister, and he is sympathetic to the colonists. So things start to kind of sway toward the colonist way. But he gets sick, and Charles Townshend is called in to manage the finances. And it's Townshend who really pushes hard to raise money from the colonies. And the first thing he did was disband the New York Assembly until they paid for their military supplies. Remember, again, Great Britain had been sending soldiers and supplies over to fight anytime the colonists needed them. So Townshend comes up with another way to raise money. It's called the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767. It taxed paper, paint, lead, tea, and glass. All of those things had to be imported because the colonies did not manufacture them. They were technically external taxes paid by everyone. The Indemnity Act of 1767 exempted tea from the British East India Company from taxation that was imported to Great Britain, but when it was exported to the colonists had to pay the tax. So Great Britain didn't have to pay it when it came from the East India Company, but remember, Great Britain has set itself up to be the middleman, so when it ships out to the colonists, they're the ones who pay the tax. This very much gave preferential treatment to the British government and created a monopoly, which further makes the colonists really not trust Parliament. And the Customs Act of 1767 created an American Board of Customs to enforce all these laws. So the Townshend Revenue Act leads to a movement back at the colonies. It's called the Non-Importation Movement. Think of it as a big shop local campaign, because that's really what it was. Samuel Adams wrote this Massachusetts circular that focused on the unconstitutionality of taxation without representation. And so they really encouraged boycotting British goods. This newsletter that Sam Adams wrote was very humble. He wasn't trying to stir up conflict. He actually wanted to restore the bond. He wanted to restore the rights of the colonists, not become independent. So even though they're angry, even though the colonists are angry with the British government, they're still not wanting out. They just want to be recognized. They want to be accepted as British. Remember, it's very important to these people, this British culture, British customs, and all of that stuff that we talked about in chapter 4. So they are not trying to be their own country. They're trying to just have representation in the country that they identify with. The Sons of Liberty were not supported by everyone. There were loyalists among the colonists who wanted peaceful protest. The Sons of Liberty used propaganda to gain support for protests. You know, when we talk about the beginnings of U.S. history, the Tea Party often comes up. The Boston Tea Party. That was a result of the Tea Act of 1773. Some people believed that it was a response to the burning of a British ship that happened the year before, but it was not. So what happened, Samuel Adams, Joseph Warren, and James Otis were the Boston Committee of Correspondence, which was an overwatch group of the British government. And they knew that the East India Company was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was on the verge of bankruptcy because the colonists had been smuggling in Dutch tea. Remember, they have this act that says they can't get tea anywhere except from the British, but they're smuggling in Dutch tea. So when the British ship with tea comes in, they dump all the tea into the harbor, which, you know, when you think about it, you're thinking, wow, it's just tea. But at the time, that was a highly sought consumer good. They dumped about $1 million worth of tea, if we're talking about it in today's money. So it was a big deal, and it caused a huge financial burden for the East India Company. So there were consequences that the colonists had to pay for their involvement in this Boston Tea Party that ruined $1 million worth in today's money of tea. First of all, the punishment included the port of Boston shut down until Massachusetts repaid that company for its debt. The Massachusetts government was placed under royal rule. They allowed the governor to move trials out of Massachusetts into royal court, so there's no more, trial by your local peers. And the Quartering Act, which did the Quartering Act, which had been rather loosely defined, now spread across all the colonies and allowed for troops to be actually housed in occupied buildings. So in many cases, soldiers were living in the homes with the colonists, which was exactly what they didn't want to begin with. So you can see it's a struggle. It's a struggle for control a struggle for recognition, basically, and the colonists wanting to maintain their relationship with Great Britain. That wraps up chapter 5 and some of the imperial acts that had an impact on the American colonies.